Domantas Sabonis is a three-time NBA All-Star, and yet he still hasn't reached the heights of his father. Standing at 7'3" with massive hands, Arvydas Sabonis was bigger than Shaq, yet he could run the floor like a gazelle. And unlike Shaq, Sabas was a good shooter. In fact, he was more accurate from the three-point line than some of the best shooters of his era. But these aren't even his best attributes. Despite a polished post-game and feathery touch, his greatest skill by far was passing. All the one-touch assists, behind the back and through the legs passing wizardry that makes Jokic dominant today, Arvydas was routinely doing 30 years ago. When he came to the NBA at the age of 31, the Portland doctors claimed that he had the ankles of a 70-year-old and that he could get a handicapped parking space based on his x-rays alone. But even with a torn Achilles, bad knees, and an arthritic foot, Sabas dominated. And if he had come to America sooner, he could have easily been the greatest center in the NBA. However, to understand what makes his career so remarkable, and one of the biggest what-ifs in NBA history, we need to go back to where it all started. Arvydas was born in 1964 in Kaunas, Lithuania, a country where basketball is a religion. So Sabas was dribbling a basketball as soon as he could walk. By the age of 13, young Arvydas joined the Žalgiris team, and he immediately started dominating against much older opponents, after which he quickly joined the USSR junior national team. But he didn't stay there for long. In 1981, after he obliterated the competition and won gold at the Under-18 European Championship, a Hall of Fame coach, Alexander Gumelsky, immediately pulled Sabonis to join the senior USSR team. The bond between the Russian coach and the Lithuanian center became like a father-son relationship, and Gumelsky became a great mentor to the young Sabas. But while this limitless trust that Sabonis had in his mentor would propel his career to the highest highs, it would also ultimately destroy him. As an 18-year-old kid, Arvydas made his World Cup debut in Colombia in 1982, where the USSR won the gold medal against the USA team led by Doc Rivers. At the time, the Cold War was at its peak, but the USSR basketball team often went on sports and peace tours in America, where they played against the best NCAA teams. That same year, after the World Cup, Sabonis played on American soil for the first time. When he squared up against Ralph Sampson, the future first overall pick of the 1983 draft, Arvydas scored 21 points with 14 rebounds. After the Soviets beat Bobby Knight's Indiana Hoosiers, the legendary coach said, "Sabonis may be the best non-American player I've ever seen," but Sabas was only warming up. When he returned home, Sabonis kept improving to the point where he became unstoppable. See, from 1936 until 1984, CSKA Moscow won every Soviet basketball championship. That's almost 50 titles in a row. And then came Sabonis, spoiling the dominance of Russia's richest team, leading Žalgiris to 3 straight championships. In 1985, the USSR walked over the competition en route to the European Championship, and in the stands watching the finals was the future NBA Hall of Famer Bill Walton. He probably had a quadruple-double in the first half. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. My jaw dropped. Arvydas could do anything. He had the skills of Larry Bird and Pete Maravich. He had the athleticism of Kareem and could shoot the three-pointer. He can pass, run, and dribble, and his blocks are pure art. We should have kidnapped him from the floor and taken him to America. Sabonis' great play prompted the Atlanta Hawks to select him with the 77th pick in the 1985 draft, but Sabonis could not come to Atlanta because of political reasons. At that time, the Soviet Union blocked any contact with the West, and it was unthinkable for someone to leave the USSR and move there. These rules apply to everyone, including top athletes. However, not only did Sabonis not come to the Hawks in 1985, he had no idea that he was even drafted. He found out about it only a year later when he was selected by the Portland Trail Blazers in 1986. After Portland drafted me, somebody told me that I had been drafted before. I didn't know that. You know, back then in the Soviet Union, we didn't get a lot of information. Without knowing anything about it, Sabonis thus became a key figure in a rule change in the NBA. Because after the Hawks failed to draft the Lithuanian, Atlanta was furious and forced the league to introduce a rule that the club that drafted the player could claim him indefinitely. Come 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Iron Curtain began to crack, and Mikhail Gorbachev started the relative democratization of the Soviet Union, and it was a big deal for athletes who could finally go abroad. The first big name in Soviet basketball to go to America was Sabonis' compatriot, who joined the Golden State Warriors in the summer of 1989. In that first wave, Vlade Divac, Los Angeles Lakers, Alexander Volkov, Atlanta, and Drazen Petrovic, Portland, also came as European pioneers. However, Sabonis didn't join them, and the biggest reason for that was his mentor, Alexander Gumelsky. Sabonis was incredibly devoted to his coach, who advised him to stay in Europe so that he could dominate back home. But that devotion would nearly end Arvydas' career. During the preparations for the 1986 World Cup in Madrid, Sabas suffered his first serious ankle injury. Despite the pain, Arvydas wanted to play to keep Gumelsky happy. And not only did Sabonis play, but he was a key figure in the craziest turnaround in the history of European basketball, when the Soviets made up a 9-point deficit in the semifinals against Yugoslavia with just over 40 left in the game. In the final, Arvydas played a great game against David Robinson, but none of the Soviet guards could catch up with speedy Kenny Smith, who won the game for the United States. A few months later, insufficiently recovered from his ankle injury, he hyperextended his Achilles tendon. Sabonis could barely walk, but he didn't know how to say no to Gmelski, so he played in the final of the domestic championship against CSKA. Zalgiris celebrated against their biggest enemy, and Sabonis played great, but the consequences remained. Then, 2 months later, during the preparations for the 1987 European Championships in Athens, Sabonis led the Soviets to a silver medal, but then it happened. His Achilles popped, and he couldn't walk anymore. He missed the entire first half of the next season, but the worst part is that this was only the beginning of his injury troubles. While rushing to answer the phone, Sabonis fell down the stairs, and his newly healed Achilles tendon ruptured again. Under normal circumstances, he would have been absent from the court for months, but at that time, in the Soviet Union, that was out of the question. Although he announced that he would not perform at the 1988 Olympic Games in Seoul, Gmelski again forced his pupil to show up. Their initial agreement was for Sabonis to go to Seoul and be a spectator, but when the tournament started, it didn't take long for Gmelski to push Sabonis into the starting five. And miraculously, it paid off. Sabonis and the Soviets defeated the USA in the semis and Yugoslavia in the finals. Arvydas dominated with 20 points and 15 rebounds in a 76-63 victory to celebrate an Olympic gold medal. For the entire 1989 season, Sabonis played on a bad Achilles. But even on one leg, he led the Soviets to another medal, this time a bronze at the European Championships. And then, when his fellow Europeans finally joined the NBA, Arvydas stayed back home because of Gmelski. Sabonis was desperately wanted by the Portland Trail Blazers, who even hired Valdas Adamkus, the future president of Lithuania, to act as a mediator and persuade Sabonis to sign the contract with Portland. But while Adamkus was waiting to board his flight to Kaunas, he heard the news that Sabonis had already signed for the Spanish team Valladolid. Without Sabonis, the Blazers made the NBA Finals in 1990 and 92, but they couldn't get over the hump.